Parents kicked me out to make room for my golden child brother and his pregnant girlfriend, but now they're begging me to come back after he vanished without a trace. I grew up in a pretty rough situation. My brother Kevin and I didn't have much. Actually, we barely had anything. Our dad worked in a factory, but most of his paycheck disappeared into his drug habit. Mom was a cashier, making next to nothing, and after dealing with rude customers all day, she'd either get high or blackout drunk almost every night. As you can guess, whatever money came in went straight to their addictions, not to, feeding their kids. Some nights, we had nothing to eat. Our cupboards were empty more often than not, and clean clothes? Forget about it. Our beds were just disgusting old mattresses on the floor, and most of our furniture was either thrifted or straight-up stuff people had tossed on the curb. Basic necessities? A luxury. The house never really felt like a home, more like a place we were stuck surviving in. And before you ask, no, CPS never showed up. Our town wasn't exactly better off, so neglectful parents weren't unusual. It wasn't like anyone around us was doing much better, and honestly, no one really cared. Our parents sure didn't. They never asked if we went to school or how we were doing, whether we ate dinner or needed medicine when we were sick. Not their problem. And when they weren't ignoring us, they were fighting. Screaming matches that sometimes turned violent. I'd hide in my room, trying to block out the chaos downstairs. Kevin would usually come in during those fights. We'd sit together, put on music, and crank the volume up just enough to drown out the yelling. It wasn't much, but it was the only escape we had. This is when the favoritism started. For most of our lives, my parents didn't care about school. They never asked if we did our homework, never checked our grades, never even seemed to notice if we skipped a day. But the second Kevin started excelling, that all changed. Suddenly, they were bragging about him to anyone who'd listen. Neighbors, relatives, random people at the grocery store. It was like they were trying to rewrite history, as if years of neglect didn't matter because now they had a golden child to show off. And Kevin? Yeah, he ate it up. I didn't blame him. For the first time, they actually cared about what he was doing. Who wouldn't want that? But the problem was, their newfound interest in parenting didn't extend to me. Instead, it became all about comparisons. Why can't you be more like Kevin? Kevin studies all the time. Maybe if you weren't wasting time with basketball, your grades would be better. Kevin doesn't complain. He just works harder. It didn't matter what I did. If it wasn't as good as Kevin, it wasn't good enough. Suddenly, I wasn't allowed to stay after school to play basketball with my friends. I had to come straight home to study, whether I wanted to or not. It felt like everything I enjoyed was being taken away because it wasn't productive enough. At first, I tried to shake it off. It wasn't Kevin's fault, but the more attention he got, the more he leaned into it. He stopped hanging out with me. He stopped backing me up when our parents were being unreasonable. If I ever complained, he'd just tell me I was overreacting, that our parents weren't that bad. Hearing that from him, the one person who actually understood what it was like growing up in our house, made me start to question myself. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe it wasn't that bad. But then I started noticing the little things. When Kevin asked for school supplies, my dad handed him money without hesitation. When I asked, use Kevin's old stuff. If I pushed back, I'd get some excuse about how money was tight, how Kevin's education was more important. And it wasn't just school stuff. My mom, who barely cooked for us before, suddenly started making home-cooked meals for Kevin. If I didn't like what she made, too bad. She wasn't cooking for me, she was cooking for him. Little things like that added up fast. The worst part? Kevin didn't seem to mind. He never called them out, never said, hey, maybe don't treat my sister like crap. If anything, he started believing he deserved it. That stung more than anything else, realizing I was losing the one person who used to have my back. When Kevin got into college on a full scholarship, I was genuinely happy for him. It was a huge deal, and he worked hard for it. My parents, of course, decided to celebrate by taking him out to a fancy dinner. When I asked if I could come, they flat out told me no. This is for Kevin. And Kevin? He didn't say a word. Didn't even try to include me. That was the moment I knew. He liked being the favorite. I didn't argue. I let them go, let them have their night. But when Kevin finally moved out for college, the house felt different. With just me and my parents, things went right back to how they used to be. Except now, somehow, it felt even worse. Once Kevin left for college, my parents went right back to how they used to be, like I barely existed. All that pride, all that energy they had when talking about him, gone. With no golden child around to brag about, they had zero interest in my life. The only time I saw them genuinely happy was when Kevin called. The second the phone rang and it was him, their faces would light up. They'd suddenly become talkative, asking about his classes, his friends, his life at school. But if I tried to share anything about my own life, Just nods and half-hearted MMHMs, like they couldn't be bothered to listen. Even when I started pulling better grades, it didn't matter. Because, of course, Kevin had done better at my age. And then one day, I overheard them talking when they thought I wasn't around. My dad, laughing, said he was just glad they had at least one exceptional kid. Then he straight up said my mom should have stopped having kids after Kevin, that if I hadn't been born, they could have given him a better life. Hearing that broke me. I always knew they favored Kevin, but actually hearing them say they wished I didn't exist, that was a different kind of pain. It made me question everything. Was I really just nothing to them? No matter how hard I tried, I'd never be enough. That's when I met Nate. I was in a bad place, stuck in my own head. When we got introduced through mutual friends, one of the first things he ever said to me was that my eyes looked beautiful, but sad. And for some reason, that hit me. Like he could actually see me. Nate grew up in a slightly better neighborhood, and while our backgrounds weren't the same, we just clicked. What started as casual hangouts turned into something real. Our first real date sealed it. I knew he was different. People say young love doesn't last, but I hope we're the exception. Because, honestly, he's been the one person who made me feel like I mattered. He never got tired of listening to me vent about my family, my struggles, all the baggage I carried. He didn't make me feel like a burden. He gave me something I hadn't had before, hope. Because of him, I worked harder in school, started saving money, and began planning for the future. But then I turned 18, and my parents made things even harder. Since I had a part-time job and some savings, they decided it was time for me to start paying rent. No warning, no discussion, just, you're an adult now, pay up or move out. I tried to explain that I was still applying to colleges, that I just needed a little more time. But they didn't care. Kevin? He never had to pay rent. Not even when he was home before college. But me? They were done supporting me the second they legally could. I cried over it. It wasn't fair. None of it was. That's when Nate told me I could move in with him. His parents were cool with it. And it was tempting. Having someone actually want me around? That was new. But as much as I loved him, I wasn't ready. Moving in together felt like too big of a step, too soon. So I stayed. And just like that, my paycheck became their safety net. Rent, groceries, bills. If they were short, guess who had to cover it? My dad even started delaying payments on purpose, blowing his money on drugs, knowing I'd have to step in. It wasn't just neglect anymore. It was manipulation. And I was stuck. I kept my mouth shut and did what they asked. I didn't want to start a fight, and honestly, I was scared of what would happen if I pushed back. Then, 3 months ago, Kevin called with some unexpected news. His girlfriend was pregnant. Huge shock, especially since they had only been dating for a few months. He sounded completely overwhelmed. Apparently, her family was super strict and didn't approve of unmarried women getting pregnant, so she needed a place to stay where she wouldn't be under constant pressure. And of course, Kevin had a solution. He wanted to move back home with her. Rent prices were too high, he said, and he needed to save money for their baby instead of throwing it all away on an apartment. But don't worry, he assured them. It was only temporary. My parents? They didn't even hesitate. No discussion, no questions, just an immediate yes. I was confused at first. Our house wasn't exactly big, and squeezing 2 extra people, soon to be 3, into Kevin's old room didn't make much sense. But I didn't have to wonder about it for long. The very next day, my parents sat me down. They told me that since Kevin and his girlfriend were moving in, it was time for me to leave. I was stunned. I asked why, and my dad just shrugged and said they needed to turn my room into a nursery. I argued. I pointed out that I had nowhere to go, that I was still paying them rent, that Kevin was an adult who should be able to figure things out without kicking me out of my own home. But they didn't care. Instead, they called me selfish. A freeloader. They said this wasn't about me, it was about their grandchild, and I needed to stop being difficult. It didn't matter that I had been paying bills and pulling my weight. It didn't matter that I was still trying to figure out my future. The only thing that mattered was making sure Kevin and his baby had a place. My mom coldly told me I had a week to pack and get out. I had no choice. I had to accept Nate's offer to move in with him. He was amazing about it, helping me pack and load everything into his truck, but I still couldn't stop the tears. As much as I hated that house, it had been my home. My room was the one place where I had felt safe, where I had dreamed of something better. Losing it, losing even that tiny bit of stability, felt like the final betrayal. Moving in with Nate was a huge adjustment. His parents were kind and understanding, and they genuinely felt bad for what I had been through. They tried to make me feel at home, but it still took time to process everything. Meanwhile, Kevin and his girlfriend moved in just as planned. Kevin called me once after the move, just once. Probably out of obligation more than anything else. He asked where I went, and I told him exactly what happened, how our parents had kicked me out to make room for him and his new family. I expected some kind of surprise, maybe even concern. Instead, he brushed it off. He called it a small sacrifice for his family, like being forced out of my home was no big deal. I couldn't believe it. I pointed out how our parents had always favored him, how they had never treated us equally. How, even now, they had made it clear that I didn't matter. And do you know what he said? That I was jealous, that I needed to grow up. That was the moment I knew whatever bond we once had was gone. For a long time, I held on to the hope that, deep down, Kevin still cared about me. But after our last conversation, it became painfully clear I was on my own. That was the moment I decided I was done. If my parents wanted to worship their golden child and play happy family with him, I wasn't going to stand in their way. I needed to move forward, even if that meant cutting them off entirely. It's been 3 months since I moved in with Nate, and honestly, life has been so much better. Things are stable now, and I've finally settled into a routine. My parents haven't called me once. No check-ins. No, how are you? Nothing. And I was fine with that. Then today, out of nowhere, my mom called. I ignored it. But then, during my lunch break, I saw several missed calls from both of them. A small part of me panicked. What if something serious had happened? So, against my better judgment, I called them back. Turns out, Kevin and his girlfriend had vanished in the middle of the night. My parents woke up to find them gone. I asked what happened, and my dad went on a rant. Apparently, when they agreed to let Kevin and his girlfriend move in, they hadn't realized how expensive it would be. His girlfriend, who was pregnant, had a big appetite, and my dad actually complained about how much she ate. On top of that, bills started piling up, and my parents expected them to start contributing. Kevin and his girlfriend refused. They argued that when they moved in, no one said anything about paying for groceries or bills. Kevin insisted that as their son, he deserved their support, no strings attached. The situation escalated, and in the middle of an argument, my mom snapped and called Kevin's girlfriend a gold digger. That was it. Kevin and his girlfriend packed up and left. In the middle of the night, Kevin didn't even say goodbye, just left a note saying he was done with them. Now my parents are panicking because Kevin won't answer their calls, and my mom is desperate to apologize. But that wasn't even the craziest part. After all of that, my dad suddenly asked me if I could reach out to Kevin for them. I told him I'd try, even though Kevin and I weren't exactly close anymore. But then my dad hit me with the real reason he called. He said that he and my mom had talked, and they wanted me to move back home. I asked why, since, they kicked me out just 3 months ago. And then he actually had the nerve to say it. If I moved back in, I could start paying them rent again, which would help them financially so they could continue supporting Kevin for free. And since my old room was now a nursery, I could just sleep on the couch. I was speechless. After forcing me out to make space for Kevin, now they wanted me back. Not because they missed me, not because they regretted anything, but because they needed money. I laughed. Then I told my dad, in no uncertain terms, that I would never move back in with them, that they deserved to be cut off, and they should be ashamed of themselves for even asking. Then I hung up. And honestly, I've never felt more at peace. Update 1. I'm honestly relieved that so many of you see how ridiculous my parents' entitlement is. It helps to know I'm not crazy for feeling the way I do. And I can't even put into words how grateful I am for Nate. Without him, I don't know where I'd be right now. After my conversation with my dad, I did end up reaching out to Kevin. I was still worried about him, despite everything. He texted back saying he was busy but would call me soon. I'll update again once we actually talk. Update 2. Just got off the phone with Kevin, and wow, my dad definitely downplayed what happened. Turns out, my mom was way worse to Kevin's girlfriend than I originally thought. She constantly made rude comments about her appearance, criticized every decision they made about the baby, and even tried to take over the nursery. And get this, my parents actually fought with Kevin and his girlfriend over the baby's name. They insisted the name had to come from my dad's side of the family, and when Kevin's girlfriend refused, my mom lost it. She told her she needed to respect the family and learn how to make decisions with them. So yeah, when things finally exploded, Kevin realized it wasn't just a one-time thing. For his girlfriend's mental well-being, he decided they needed to leave immediately. They're staying with one of his friends for now, and he assured me they're managing. Then, this part actually shocked me. Kevin admitted that I was right all along, that our parents had always been unfair, that they did mistreat me, and that he was sorry for not seeing it sooner. Did it feel good to hear? Yeah, a little. But let's be real. Kevin only opened his eyes because they started treating his girlfriend the way they treated me my whole life. One apology doesn't erase everything. Update 3. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been following along and supporting me these past few months. And now, I finally have some good news. I got accepted into a local college. Nate and I are both excited for this next chapter. With his encouragement, I've saved up a solid amount of money, and I'm now planning to move into a small apartment with a roommate. For those asking, yes, Kevin and his girlfriend are doing fine. And as for our relationship, it's actually getting better. After everything, we both decided to completely cut off our parents. Looking back, I'm grateful they kicked me out for Kevin. It was the push I needed to finally escape and start building something for myself.